Thank you to everyone for joining us for this webinar co-hosted by the Council on Foundations and the Association of Corporate Citizenship Professionals, Values Aligned Philanthropy, Corporations Taking a Stand. I will now turn it over to David Kass, Vice President for Government Affairs and Legal Resources at the Council on Foundations.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Welcome, everyone. It's terrific to be here with you and really looking forward to an interesting conversation. So over the past couple of years, the Council on Foundations has been doing our best to really understand this issue of the funding of hate and extremism, and also to provide support to the philanthropic sector to end it. We've seen hate-based violence and anti-government extremism on the rise. And so it's become even more urgent for every sector, including philanthropy and corporate philanthropy, to look at whether philanthropic policies and practices are not inadvertently going against our values. So the Council on Foundations is a big tent philanthropic network. We have over 800 member organizations with corporate foundations, private foundations, community foundations, and others. And we call our approach values-aligned philanthropy. And that's a specific term that we think is actually really important, because our goal is to help the philanthropic sector to match their giving to their values. You know, we know there's not one right approach, right? Different companies are going to have different values, but we provided some tools to help, hopefully, that will be helpful to align your giving and your values. So the first thing we created, though, was a resource hub on our website. And then in the chat, you'll see a link to that resource hub. And the resource hub includes our landscape report, where we talked with leaders in the field to understand the issues and best practices in the field. The report also has some recommendations for taking action. And the resource hub has links to sample policies, to reports and data, and media coverage of the issue too. We've also worked to create resources for different parts of philanthropy, including corporate philanthropy. We know corporate philanthropy is complex and it faces unique challenges. And we also know that corporations are leaders in public opinion and have an influential role to play, and that when companies take a stand, people really listen. So in addition to this webinar, we've created a document to help you get started. It's called Are We Funding Hate? Frequently asked questions about corporate risk, responsibility, and response. And we're putting the link to that in the chat and invite you to check it out. It's very short, but hopefully gives some really good information. This webinar is a chance for you to hear from some corporations who have generously agreed to share their approach and their experience with us. And after hearing from each of them, we'll have time for Q&A. So please add your questions to the chat and we'll take as many as we can. We're really happy to partner with the Association of Corporate Citizenship Professionals on today's program. ACCP has been a great partner and look forward to continuing to work together. So I guess I just want to start there. First, turn it over to Lacey Gaitan. Lacey is been terrific to work with, and let me start with her. Lacey, you have been hearing from your members about just some of these issues and would love to hear what your experiences have been and just what the journey has been that you've seen for your members.
Thanks, David. Yeah, we are thrilled to work with the Council on Foundations on this. We know that it is an area where there's a lot of questions and uncertainty for our members. We've been hearing from a lot of members, but they're some are nervous about asking that question. We've been getting many of these questions anonymously as they really are trying to figure out how to grapple with the issue. And they may not use the exact phrase values-aligned philanthropy, but we have been getting a lot of questions related to this topic, and especially when it comes to their employee giving efforts. Questions like, how do we ensure that our matching gifts don't support organizations with discriminatory practices? Or what do we do if we've sent a check to a grantee and then find out that they support something that we stand against? Or even the, coming down to the logistics of it, our legal team, they're recommending all these compliance affirmations, but we don't have the capacity, the people, the technical capabilities to support that. So how do we know that we are appropriately vetting our grantees and our partner organizations? There's been a lot of recent questions as well about supporting advocacy organizations and efforts, especially in this last year, surrounding the war in Ukraine, gun violence, LGBTQ and reproductive health policies. And, what do they do and how do they support their employees and their communities around these issues? We're seeing both a mix of companies who are working to limit or further clarify who is eligible for their funding, as well as companies that are broadening and expanding their eligibility criteria. And a lot of these questions are coming in from very engaged employee audiences that are approaching their CSR teams wanting to know, what are you doing? Why are you doing it this way? Why do you give here? Why not there? And we know that a lot of our CSR teams are really grappling with where their social impact dollars support versus where maybe their PAC fund money is going or their corporate dollars are spent, and how do they align all of that together, and then not only just align that giving but go back and explain that to their employee base. So we've been getting a lot of questions. I will say it's an area that we know our members are trying to figure out and understand, how do they best approach values aligned giving with their work.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that. Why don't we turn it next to Dr. Shanell McGoy, who's the Senior Director for Public Affairs and Corporate Social Responsibility at Gilead Sciences. We'd just love to hear what your experience at your company has been and some of the challenges and learnings that you've had and the program that you all put together.
Thank you so much for having me. This is certainly a very important topic and one that's near and dear to my heart and to the company that I work for, Gilead Sciences. I was thinking about a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King from one of his famous sermons called "Loving Your Enemies." And the quote is, "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And when I think about our work in philanthropy and CSR, we're really that light and that love that drives out hate. And Gilead has been committed to addressing issues of equity, justice, and particularly denouncing hate. Our CEO and many of our senior level leaders have also made statements around relevant issues that are happening across the globe, from unrest in Iran to the war in Ukraine, to violence against Asian communities, reproductive health issues, and also, importantly, the murder of George Floyd. And I think it starts at the top in making a statement and creating a culture of inclusion and one that resists any type of hate. Gilead's core values are integrity, inclusion, teamwork, accountability, and excellence. And especially those first two, in integrity and inclusion, doing what's right and encouraging diversity, which really guides the work of the company as well as the work of our philanthropy and CSR. And so it's important that then our team, our entire company embraces these values, as well as the actions around denouncing hate that exist. And we have several initiatives that I'd love to share more throughout our talk that we are doing just that.
Well, great. Well, would you mind just share about some of the initiatives, or how's the company been working on these issues, and just any learnings to share with the audience would be great.
Absolutely. The first one, after 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, there were many internal conversations around racial equity and social justice. So the company Gilead Sciences made a commitment, financial commitment, to several organizations immediately after the murder of George Floyd. After that, we took an internal look and wanted to be very strategic about what our next moves would be. and to really make it a part of what the core of who we are and what we do. And so with that, a small team was formed, 4 people, a very small team. And we took the opportunity to listen and to learn from our colleagues and to really look outside and see what external, what our partners, what our competitors were doing to address racial equity, what type of statements were made, and what type of commitments or funding was made to organizations. And through that, we came up with 3 particular areas and an initiative called the Racial Equity Community Impact Fund. $10 million to 20 organizations in 3 specific areas. And those areas include community advocacy and mobilization. So really funding organizations who are doing grassroots work. We vetted those organizations. We made sure that their values aligned with our values. And then the next one is social justice. We identified 6 historically Black colleges and universities with a tradition in social justice and civil rights movement. Many of these HBCUs made commitments and were part of sit-ins in the 60s, integrating libraries, lunch counters, and that work has still continued around social justice and racial equity. So we made a commitment to 6 HBCUs to continue their work now around social justice. And then the third area is educational innovation. And this really takes a cradle to career approach, providing communities with the skills, be it job training, be it early childhood education, to be productive. Economics is important when we talk about addressing equity in communities. And so these organizations provide that for communities from cradle to career. And so you asked, what do these 3 areas have to do with hate and extremism? It's about preparing communities, families, and leaders to address these issues head on and create equity and justice for all.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let me turn it now to Peter Stern. Thank you so much for being here, Peter. We learned we actually were in the same class in college. That's not the reason that he's here. We just learned that. So Peter's the Director for Content Policy Stakeholder Engagement at Meta. Peter, just love to hear what you all have been doing at Meta and just some of the lessons that you learned around working on these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I've been at Meta for 8 years now. I was formerly a lawyer in private practice. So in some ways, I'm a little bit of a visitor from another world here, not being a CSR professional or a professional in philanthropy. But the more I listen to these remarks and read the Values Aligned Philanthropy white paper, the more it seems to me that in these important areas, we really have a lot in common and a lot of knowledge and experience to share with each other. I'm on something called the Content Policy Team. That's the team that creates the rules for what people are allowed to share on Facebook and Instagram, the community standards, ads policies. We also develop policies around certain major changes in feed ranking, certain types of algorithms, recommender systems, and also specific types of products, Facebook fundraiser being one of them. My specific role is to conduct what we call stakeholder engagement. Whenever we're considering a new policy, we develop a strategy for going out to civil society and academia, identifying the people who will have the most knowledge, the most at stake, the most relevant types of experience about this policy, and having discussions either one-on-one or in small group settings to get their views on how they think that the current policy is operating, whether they think that we may need to make a change, and a whole range of issues on a worldwide basis. So when the company developed the Facebook fundraiser product a couple of years ago, it became clear that we needed to develop a set of policies around eligibility for fundraiser. And the reasons for that, I think, are really well spelled out in the in the white paper, and I think have much in common with the other views and concerns that many people have expressed. We've got quite well-developed policies governing individual pieces of content on the platform, where people can report, or our automated systems identify certain types of content and will then make a decision about whether to leave it up or remove it under our policies. And we've also got a very well-developed approach to what we call dangerous organizations and individuals, groups that promote violence, white supremacy, again, on a worldwide basis, a wide range of groups that we don't allow to have any presence on the platform. So the question then arose with the development of Fundraiser, should we have an additional set of policies to govern specific access to that product in cases where a group was not kicked off the platform entirely? And digging into it, we determined that that did make sense. And so we went about developing the policy. And the policy is contained at the end of the white paper, and you can see it on our website. It's relatively detailed. I think what I would say is, and maybe here my perspective is of being able to share a fair amount of background with other groups. We had some tools to hand that really helped us in this effort. One of them being a set of definitions and policy approaches that we had developed over time. So for example, what is hate speech? Well, there's no international consensus on what hate speech is. But we have a definition of hate speech, and you can disagree with it. And I certainly talk to people who feel like that could be improved upon, but it is quite well articulated and actually has a lot in common with the FBI's definition of hate speech, as I noticed in rereading that paper. And so we were able to employ that, and clearly violation of our hate speech policies is going to be one signal to us that maybe a group shouldn't be allowed to fundraise on the platform. There are other signals like that we were able to leverage in order to build a policy. Another thing that we had going for us was a quite well-developed policy development mechanism. We do this every day in a sense. We've always got a pipeline of policies that we're working on, where we are coming up with options and recommendations. We're doing research. We are doing extensive stakeholder engagement to map out how various people around the world think that we ought to handle these issues. And there too, we were able to take advantage of that framework to reach out to global stakeholders to build our fundraiser policy. I'll stop there, but maybe we can get into some of the things that we learned in the course of that stakeholder engagement as we go on.
Please do. I mean, that would be a great thing to hear, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure. Well, we talked to a variety of groups. I think there's probably three main buckets. One is experts on hate and extremism, and who are very familiar with the landscape of hateful and terrorist groups around the world. This is an area that where we have pretty well developed connections. Although it was interesting, we in at least one case that I recall, we also talked to a former extremist who is now turned his life around and is an advocate for peace and an anti-hate expert, really. And so, we spoke to him about how groups, having been on the other side, how do groups, what sort of funding do they need? What are their requirements? What does this mean to them? How can we best sort of cut this off when the occasion arises? The second bucket was members of civil society, either who have a specific expertise in anti-extremism or who have been victims of extremist work that has been potentially fueled by fundraising. And then the third group, one that was new for us, and which is kind of the reason that I'm here, which is nice, is members of the philanthropic community. We wanted to learn what were the trends, how groups were in this world were sizing up the whole thorny set of questions around stopping fundraising for certain types of groups. And clearly that is top of mind for many others as well. So in terms of what we learned, I guess there are a couple of things that I would point to. One point that came through loud and clear is that there's a consensus that fundraising should be treated differently, and access to a fundraising product should be treated differently from ordinary speech on the platform. This may seem like a not an earth-shaking observation, but it has deep implications, particularly for a platform whose paramount value is voice, and really kind of gives us a basis to move and to take action against certain types of groups that we wouldn't otherwise have. So the particularities of the fundraising setting, I think, really came out to us in this engagement. We learned a lot, and I think we're able to bring that to bear in the policy. A second point that was important was really what we're talking about here today, which is the movement within the philanthropic community to be more stringent about access to fundraising products, to re-examine values, and to make sure that fundraising efforts are congruent with the values of particular organizations. That too kind of bolstered the work that we were doing. And a third point that I think was quite important for us was that the experts that we talked to encouraged us to look beyond the behavior of groups on our platform in making determinations about whether they were going to be eligible for a fundraiser. Ordinarily, when we are evaluating an individual piece of content, we're kind of calling balls and strikes on that piece of content within the four corners of the post or the share, or whatever it may be. In the world of dangerous organizations and individuals, we go quite a bit beyond that. We do our own research, we talk to many other experts, and we try to develop a holistic picture of an entity or an individual that may merit removal from the platform, even though what they've posted on the platform is not problematic. In fact, we banned groups that don't have a presence on the platform, but we just said they're not going to be allowed on the platform. Here, the weight of the opinion that we heard made clear to us that we needed to apply this broader type of analysis when we were looking at issues of eligibility to fundraiser. So that's another thing that we built into the policy, and that was quite important for us in orienting us in this area.
That is super helpful. Thank you so much. I think one of the things that what I'm hearing really is just underscored is that this takes some time to think these things through, right? These are complicated issues, and that there are people who have some expertise, other companies, other colleagues, other organizations to reach out to. And I'm just curious. So, if a company, your boss walks in and says, "Hey, I want to develop some policies here," where would you suggest people start? I mean, and particularly, how do you bring together different parts of the company? Who needs to be part of that? So you're developing something that the company will really embrace, rather than it's something that, you did a great job and that's collecting some dust. For any of our panelists.
Yeah, I'll start. I think that the message coming from leadership, starting with your leadership team, the CEO and others, but it really takes the middle to move whatever is important to the company. That's where you'll see the traction in the movement. And I think that also there are a number of companies that have employee resource groups. So that's a body of people who convene regularly and who convene around a particular cause or mission. And so that's another group that's can aid in moving things forward, as well as your DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion teams. And from there, it's also important to engage external partners. So for example, Gilead is a biopharmaceutical company based in Foster City, California. And one of our areas is HIV. And we know HIV impacts LGBTQ communities, Black and Brown communities. And when we look at geography in the US, the Southern United States. The Southern United States is half of HIV diagnosis each year in this country, but a third of the US population. So we see the disparity that exists there. And so we partner with organizations that represent those communities. We have a 10-year, $100 million commitment to address HIV in the Southern United States. And as I was listening to Peter, one of the things that struck me is how people who are perpetuating hate speech, we call them out, but we also call them in. There was an example of a rapper last year who made some disparaging, really ugly comments about the LGBTQ community, as well as people living with HIV. And so our partners through the Gilead Compass Initiative released a statement really calling him in to have conversation and dialogue that educates him about HIV and introduces him to people living with HIV, as well as educating him about the LGBTQ community. And so, there are ways that you can call people in to address those issues, to listen to them and have respectful dialogue that encourages them not to continue to perpetuate this hate speech. And then the question that you asked, where do you start? So I think it's both internal and external, and making sure that your company's values align with the work that you're doing, and that you're also doing the work on the inside, so that if you have an external statement or you're making commitments, financial commitments to organizations on the outside, that your employees are also well taken care of, and that you're not perpetuating hate internally, and that your policies align with those values and the commitments that you make externally.
That's great. Peter or Lacey, anything you wanted to add to that?
I would just add everything Dr. McGoy said was spot on, but also really, if you are a global organization, include the voices of your global employees. They're going to have different perspectives on what hate and extremism means, and it's really important to incorporate all of those perspectives.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And making it clear that there is buy-in from the highest levels is extremely important. In our case, I think that, as I mentioned, we've got the benefit of quite a bit of work in this area. It's something that's essential for our business. And so we've got a real commitment to build out these policies. And fortunately, Fundraiser was able to fit into that framework.
I also wanted to add that employee giving is an important piece. And so if your company's fortunate enough to have opportunities for employees to give, when issues or crises arise, such as the war in Ukraine or unrest in Iran or violence against Asian communities, or even domestically, the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, that there are opportunities for your employees to give to organizations that are moving the needle in these communities, in these areas. And so through employee giving, identifying, asking your employee resource groups or asking employees, what organizations do you know that are really addressing and tackling these issues, and then vetting them to make sure that those organizations align with your company's values, and providing the opportunity to either match, so employees giving or matching their donations, so that funding can be more robust to address these issues.
That's great. And I'm just curious, as you've had these conversations in your companies, how much has it been around, well, this is the right thing to do, and how much has this been around, look, this really has an impact on our business and our bottom line, and we need to be prepared. So I'm just curious, how have those two things come out in the discussions for all of you?
It's twofold. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's twofold. As I mentioned, one of our core values at Gilead is integrity, doing what's right. So it's the right thing to do. And then secondly, it's what does it mean for our company and the communities that we serve? For example, through our therapeutics at Gilead, We always say that we're more than medicine. We address the barriers, social, cultural barriers that impede optimal healthcare for all, right? So it may impact our business, but it's also important to remove barriers so that whatever therapeutic an individual chooses who's living with HIV or hepatitis, that they can achieve optimal health.
I do think, David, that values are intention, but I don't think one of those values, at least in our case, is making money. I think the issue is, as in so many areas that we deal with, what is the proper boundary line between safety on the one hand and giving people voice? Because there is a current of opinion that sees fundraising as a matter of speech and sees curtailment of access to fundraising as a kind of a diminishment of non-mainstream views. And I think that may be the set of opinions that come into play in talking with employees or in talking with external groups. And I think that is the set of determinations that have to be addressed in the policymaking process. And, you know, in our case, the policy that we came up with is the statement of how we resolve that.
That makes sense. And I think it really also underscores the importance of being prepared so that, you know, if there is something that happens where your company is being criticized, that you have some clarity about what those values are and why you're doing it, and sort of agreement across the organization, across the business. So I'm just also curious, Shanell, you talked about how the importance of having the values and defining them. Can you talk about your company's process, you know, particularly around the hate funding and how you develop those?
Sure. I really, truly believe it's about being proactive and putting things in place that will allow us to respond rapidly when crises occur, right? So addressing issues around reproductive health. We also know that it's addressing LGBTQ health issues, as well as health issues for Black and Brown communities, or the historically marginalized and underserved communities. So it's about optimal, again, for me and for Gilead, it's about optimal health for all and putting the policies in place that will allow us to do that, as well as internally for our employees and my colleagues, right? That our health policies, the insurance access is available and addresses the diverse needs of our colleagues.
So that's really helpful. And Lacey, I'm just curious if you've seen, in talking to some of your members, is there any differences you've seen in public companies versus private companies? Or are the issues really pretty similar across?
I mean, I think one of the big differences that have historically been between public and private companies is what they are required to report on versus not required to report on, which when it comes to your social impact and your philanthropic giving, especially right now, that kind of goes away, because for both public and private companies, employees want to know, who are you giving to, where are you giving to, why? Consumers want to know, who are you giving to, where are you giving to, why? And we have a more active employee base, more educated consumers than ever. And so public and private companies, both, whether they're required to report out on or have transparency about these things, they are now seeing that it is a stakeholder issue that they can't afford not to address. They have to be open with what they are doing and why. And to Shanell's point, like, you need to have these conversations. You need to be prepared to address it, because we don't know when the next policy issue is going to come up. We don't know when the next disaster or act of violence is going to come up. So we have to have these conversations within our companies now, whether we're public, whether we're private, whether we're giving from direct from corporate giving or through a corporate foundation. Those conversations, those policies have to be in place so that when something comes up, you're ready to address it, because it's not a matter of if something's going to happen, it's when. And it's not a matter of, are your employees going to ask about it? Do consumers want to know? They do. We know that employees are asking, consumers are asking, so we have to be ready to address it.
That's helpful. And Peter, you were talking about developing the criteria for how you consider what's considered a hate group. And as we know, there isn't one definition that everybody agrees is the right thing, or one list that everybody agrees. There's several organizations that do lists, but people have different perspectives. So can you just talk about how the process of doing that, and just any advice for others who are thinking about how do they come up with their own definition that can work for their company?
Yeah, I think there are models out there, and there are a variety of organizations who have taken the lead in trying to craft definitions. I think that anything you start with is probably not going to be where you end up, in the sense that you're going to need to tweak models and make sure that it works well for you. Certainly, the approach that we have, I can't imagine would be appropriate, off the shelf for other groups, just because it is so much needing to be responsive to the way that we encounter content on the platform, the types of content that we see. But I think they're going to be commonalities. However you choose to draw the line around hate speech, that would be one indicator. Support for planned acts of violence, even if you're not dealing with a call to attack what we would call a protected characteristic, meaning members of a religion or an ethnicity or a nationality. There can be support for violence that does not specifically get into that realm, but that nonetheless would be very problematic. And then there's certain violation of certain other types of policies that we regard as very important, and signals for why it might not be appropriate to make fundraiser available. So I think you've got to kind of, I wouldn't like to really give advice to anybody in this area, because our situation is quite specific. But I think there's likely to be an issue of finding a fit between the needs that you have, the models that you've got, and your internal and external stakeholders, to be sure.
That's great. Thank you. And I just want to encourage folks who are watching this, if you have any questions, please do send them in through the chat. We'd love to get as many questions as possible. So one question we got from a viewer was, are there industry organizations like PEAK or the Council on Foundations, ACCP, or consultants active in the space that can help with the operationalizing of these principles? Any thoughts there, panelists, on resources that folks can reach out to? In addition to the awesome one-pager that the council just produced, of course, and great materials from ACCP, but anything else where folks should look that you found to be helpful?
I could say from the ACCP perspective that while we as an organization aren't necessarily helping operationalize these, what we're doing is creating the community for our members to talk to each other openly, to ask each other, what are you doing? Why? What's been successful? What have you found? Because it really is about, you want that internal perspective, but you also want to hear from others externally. What has worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? Why didn't it? Because it may not have worked for one organization to have X policy, but it could work for another organization because, David, to your point at the beginning of this, each company has different values. So figuring out what works for your organization is, it's a different thing for each organization. But what we at ACCP do is create the community for our members to have those open conversations with each other, to learn from each other, and to really help each other move forward.
I guess what I would say, David, is that I think the white paper is a very good place to start. There's a ton of good information. It's a very impressive document, and people can pick up the threads there. I think the other thing is that there's a huge amount of activity now in the space of seeking to identify and remove hateful elements online, but much more broadly. And I think it would be possible for members of the philanthropic community to plug into some of those networks and events and sort of bring your problems to that forum and get input and advice. I mean, for example, a really big topic these days is hate in the world of sports. What people say at sporting events, how athletes are treated. It's hugely important and involves our company and many, many others. And you've started to see panels on this subject at some of the major convenings around the problem of hate in society. And I could imagine a similar kind of scenario, if it hasn't already started, with respect to philanthropy, that could be very generative of ideas for people.
And I just wanted to add here, I think of it in 4 entities. So subject matter expertise or subject matter experts who are in academia, who are publishing and studying hate speech or whatever particular subject matter or topic that your company may align with and wants to address this issue. So, you know, the data drives a lot of action. And I know for us, we rely on the data to guide where the need is and then to address issues. The second one is governmental agencies that produce white papers in this area. And I think Peter has spoke to a number of those governmental agencies who either define or can provide some recommendations around this topic. And then third is community advocacy and grassroots organizations. As I mentioned in our Racial Equity Community Impact Fund, one of the pillars is community advocacy and mobilization. And so there are organizations who are at the grassroots level, door to door, working with people and mobilizing people to address hate and extremism. And so finding those organizations, and they often have recommendations and want to be heard around where funding could best be utilized. And then the last one was, again, legal communities that can provide you with the policy and procedure that either you can adopt or adapt to your organizations.
That's really helpful. And I'm just curious, you know, your companies have done a lot of work in this area, and you talked, if you could talk some more about just the public response you've gotten to it. I mean, obviously you're never going to make everybody happy, but have you gotten some good feedback? And then where have the places been that it's been kind of challenging?
Sure. For Gilead, we have received some good feedback from communities, from or organizations that we support, highlighting the work that they do and how Gilead has been a good partner to them and supporting them in the work that they do. And we also have received, you know, a number of publications that highlight our work. One of the most recent works that we've done is a report around COVID-19's impact on HIV and what CDC had called the lost year. And this relates to particularly people living with HIV, Black and Brown communities, as well as LGBTQ communities, and how many have been weren't able to continue their care or access their care in the same way because of the spotlight and addressing emerging issues like COVID and monkeypox. And with that, when we think about hate speech, the way that our Asian brothers and sisters were impacted around COVID, and the layering or multiple, the intersections around health for communities living with HIV as well as LGBTQ communities. And so that report, we were quoted in Time magazine most recently about that report. And so we've received a lot of support around our work. When you ask, have there been some challenges? I think challenges may arise around who we may be supporting and how much impact we have. So really being able to articulate what the change is or the impact. Change doesn't happen quickly. It takes time to really see the fruits of your labor and the results while things continue to happen in our society. So I think that may be one of the challenges that we face. What impact have we made and what are the outcomes? And we have those to share with people, but it doesn't come the day that you make a commitment, financial commitment to an organization. I think it takes time to really be able to see the change that occurs.
Yeah, I think the response to the policy that we developed has been positive. Certainly amongst the stakeholders that we talk to, we always circle back and inform them where we landed, give them some detail into the recommendation that was adopted. And I think that was quite well received. I do note, though, that somebody mentioned you can't please everybody. Maybe that was you, David. That's very true. And any policy that you adopt, you need to be prepared to talk both to employees and to external parties about it. And be as transparent as you can and as forthcoming as you can, with the knowledge that you can get trust and respect. I would hope, even if people don't agree on exactly where you drew the line.
We got another question from the audience. Hate speech has become more nuanced these days, especially for think tanks and other agencies. How are you looking at discerning who to fund or not fund based on these subtleties? What kinds of conversations you're having around this? Very few hate groups come out and say we hate, but maybe advocating for policies that produce a lot of harm without explicitly saying they're hate groups. Now, I was just having this conversation with my kids at dinner about this work, and like, Dad, why don't they just not fund if it's a hate group, right? I mean, it just sounds so simple. So just anyone who wanted to address this question would be great.
Well, that's very true. That's a very astute observation. I think if you talk to experts who are familiar with hate speech, hate groups around the country, they'll tell you that the language that they're seeing is not as blatant as it used to be. And so for us, that means learning the signals, learning the coded words as best we can, as quickly as we can, and trying to understand networks out there where you may be able to detect problematic speech or conduct that you wouldn't otherwise. Who spoke on whose podcast, who is authoritatively reported to have made a positive comment about a problematic figure at an event. This is one reason why I stress the importance of looking at off-platform content as well as on-platform content. I think you need to do some digging, which does require resources, but ultimately will take you further to a good determination in that area.
Absolutely, I agree with Peter. It's doing the due diligence and vetting organizations before you make commitments or align yourself with them. And it's the searches on Google. It's reading all types of social media and accessing it to see if they are aligned with others who may have perpetuated hate speech or extremism. So it's really doing the due diligence to find out who they are and who they're aligned with.
That's great. Thank you for that. So I'm also just curious, as you've been thinking about the best way to move this forward. I mean, what I think I hear each of you saying is that it's going to take some time. You're not going to get it perfectly right. You're going to have some learnings along the way. It's important to go across the organization, to go across the business, and try to get leadership involved. I'm just curious, what other tips would you have for people who are starting, or just other businesses who are working on this issue?
That's a good question. I think that other advice or tips I would have is looking at other companies who are in your space to see what type of commitments and responses that they have had. I think it's also important to, that's an excellent question, to walk the walk and talk the talk. So if you're making statements, that your actions follow those statements as well. You want to be authentic in your commitments and the work that you do. And then making sure that your commitments, your messaging is transformational and not just transactional. We use that often in the work that we do, that the relationships that we build with organizations and with partners is part of a lifetime, that you're part of our family, and that we will continue to support you as long as we're aligned in our values and commitments and actions. And so there are ways that we can continue our relationship beyond versus a one-time statement or a one-time commitment or check, but really identifying how those relationships can evolve and be transformational.
So before I just go to Peter and Lacey, can you talk more about that? I mean, that sounds like a really important value for the company.
Yeah, it is. So one example of this is I mentioned through our Racial Equity Community Impact Fund that we funded 6 HBCUs, or historically Black colleges. And they were selected because of their commitment to social justice, many of them having history with the civil rights movement. So one of those HBCUs is Tougaloo College outside of Jackson, Mississippi, near Jackson, Mississippi. And so we funded them for social justice work, but that relationship has expanded, and we're moving into women's health. And so we've supported an investigator there to look at breast cancer awareness and breast cancer awareness and education. So that relationship has transformed from social justice into reproductive health and breast cancer awareness for women. And we've also continued our commitments to HBCUs, most recently attending their homecomings and being there to support the work that they do. Another example is Morehouse College, history steeped in where Dr. Martin Luther King graduated from, right, in social justice issues. And we're supporting their work around education and cultivating educators and leaders. And that's another commitment. We were there for, I think there are 9 HBCUs that we've added to be at their homecoming events this year. It was just at one this weekend, and raising awareness around social justice issues, around health equity. And when we look at hate speech, it's about preparing and cultivating leaders to be able to address these issues. We know those institutions have a commitment. We've just extended our relationship in new areas. And so supporting those institutions and the students that are there, knowing their values as an institution, we know that they'll be able to be transformative around issues of equity and around justice and denouncing hate and extremism.
Thank you. Peter or Lacey, who would like just, any other tips on
Maybe
folks who
throw out an example from our space. This kind of reminds me of 6-7 years ago, shortly after I joined the company, and we were beginning to develop standalone teams to fight terrorism. And because we were one of the bigger players, we got up to speed and then found that smaller companies would come to us and ask us for thoughts on how to get started. And, we really saw this as being a whole industry-wide problem. And so to the extent that we could, we were very happy to share with them our experience. I suspect that might be the same kind of pattern in your world as well. It's something that, if you consider yourself to be a leader, you can pull other people along too. And obviously there are limits to that, but you may find that you get a positive reception if you reach out to companies that have spent more time thinking about this, worrying about this, and asking them for their insights.
No, that's great. And we've certainly seen with our community foundation members that, there are policies that they've written that are on their website, and people who've been you don't have to start new. You can reach out to other colleagues who've spent a lot of time on this and benefit from their learnings. Lacey, how about you? Anything else, other tips that you would give to people who are working on this issue, or particularly those starting out?
I would just say to get comfortable not being the expert. You're not going to be an expert in this topic, but you need to be willing to ask and learn and grow from that. Because if we had already figured all of this out, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. So we're not an expert, but we can ask and learn, and we can grow and help our companies move forward as we do that.
That's a great place to end. Right. It is complicated. It's going to be a little messy, but it's really important for your business. So thank you for adding that. Well, I just want to thank the three of you for being on this panel today. It's really interesting, very helpful. Thank you for all you're doing with your businesses and the work. I think this is very helpful. So appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining today who watched it.